Salam alaikum. Good evening. It's a great honor to be here. It's a great honor to be on this panel with Dr. Matson and Dr. Abdullah. And I take it that the theme of this whole conference is, given the sacred laws of Islam and the Ten Commandments, what is it that we are to do, and how is it that we're to find the courage to do it? The courage, the energy, the consciousness. It's beginning with Socrates, an unexamined life is not worth living. But from that point, what are we to do with the examination? How are we to lift ourselves up? And it's always good in a country to have people who've shown that they can stand there in their place. And I noticed that I think Mayor Arar is still here. Yes, there he is. And I know many of you know him. You should stand up, Mayor, because there's an example of what a citizen can do. And I say that because what he did was he was wronged, and with patience and stubbornness and grace and determination, he pushed on through with his wife, Monia, and won, and proved that Muslims are not to be put aside in Canada. They're not to be ignored, that they are an integrated part of our society. And he won that. And in winning it for himself, he won it, I think, for all Muslims in Canada. And frankly, he won it for me. He won it because he showed what a good citizen is. And so in a way, it's always interesting when Americans and Canadians come together because there's a slightly different tone. We're not that different, but there's a slightly different tone. And while I know there are still many difficulties for Muslims in Canada, yet I feel, and I have many friends who are Muslim, that it isn't the case that is being described in the United States. That we have a Muslim mayor of Calgary, that things are going better and better, that the place of Muslims in this country is becoming stronger and stronger, and will become stronger and stronger, and that will be extremely good for this country. I want to say three very basic things. The first is local and practical, and it's a criticism of Canada. And that is, here we are in a city which, if you draw the borders, not legally, but humanly, of a city of about 8 million people. And yet, in this city of 34 million, in this country of 34 million, a city of 8 million, there isn't a single training place that I know of for Islamic or Hebraic religious leaders. This is astonishing. Here we are in a city which is probably the cutting-edge city in terms of diversity and pluralism. 50% of the population wasn't born here. Probably another 20 to 25% are the children of people who weren't born here. This is a very experimental, cutting-edge culture. There are others doing the same thing, the United States, Australia, and so on. But this is the place where the percentages are highest. We're the furthest out on the cutting edge of reinventing what the doctor just described as the nation state, to become another sort of thing, which is not monolithic. It maybe is not monolithic in terms of the peoples who live there. And yet, we don't have our own training centers for religious leaders from 2 of the 3 Abrahamic faiths, which is very peculiar. Of course, the religions are universal, but interpretations all come with points of view. And pluralism, support for pluralism, isn't something which is natural in the history of the last few hundred years anywhere. It's a concept that we have to nurture, that we have to work on every single day. And what I'm saying here is not a criticism of the religious leaders we have who have come from elsewhere and have been trained elsewhere. Quite the contrary, in a way, I feel sorry for them because it's a very tough business to be trained in one place and to come to another civilization and to have to attempt to figure out what are the unspoken grassroots emotions and reactions of people, which are bound to be very different in every place. But more important than that, I think we're missing something which is essential, the ability to explain ourselves to ourselves easily through this training. And we're missing an opportunity perhaps to export those ideas of diversity and pluralism through religious leaders who would be trained here and who might go elsewhere in the world to talk about how we do things. Flawed, but interesting. And the strange thing is that this is a country which for 150 years has had only public universities. That is the basis of our democracy, public schooling and public universities. And yet they are only training Christian religious leaders. This is not reflective of our civilization in any way, shape, or form. They have an obligation to be training religious leaders for Islam and for the Hebraic faith. And I think that this conference is in a sense playing the role that our universities should be playing at least a part of. And I'm saying this because making pluralism work is something which does come, I think, very naturally to Muslims. It is, after all, an existential or a rational matter. Of the three faiths, Abrahamic faiths, Islam is the one which can claim most easily to have a rational base. And it is clearly within the aims of the Islamic sacred law. Specifically, for example, human dignity, just as it's within the 9th and 10th of the 10 Commandments. The second point I want to make has to do with freedom of expression. PEN is an astonishing organization. It's the second oldest NGO in the world. Many of the PEN centers are in Islamic countries where there are many difficulties with the governments, but not with the citizens. I've just come from Egypt from a meeting of all of the African PEN centers, including the PEN centers coming from Islamic countries. And what I would say is this, as president of PEN International, of tens of thousands of writers around the world, many of them Muslims, what I would say is this, that the creation of a religion, you go back to the beginning of Islam, the creation of a religion, the delivery of a religion is an exercise in freedom of expression. It's a battle of ideas, of language. It's an intellectual struggle, and I note the intellect is one of the things in your sacred law. It is about openness, and of course it's always struggled against by those who are already in place. So there is often a physical battle, but above all there's an intellectual and an ethical and a spiritual battle. And the creation of all three of the Abrahamic faiths was an astonishing expression of freedom of expression. But of course, once it's in place, once people start to take power, a certain number of them who have power and influence will find that it's much more comfortable to hold power of all sorts by limiting freedom of expression. And they will use religious rules and laws to do that. And yet, freedom of expression is key to the flowering of all three of these religions. Yes, there is absolutely no question that the misuse of freedom of expression is a terrible thing. And when it's focused, as it has been in many cases on Islam over the last decade, it is a terrible and unacceptable thing. And indeed, as has already been mentioned by Dr. Abdullah, the colonial period was another example of that. But that doesn't justify in any of the faiths cutting back on freedom of expression. This cannot be used as an excuse. It can be done because it protects the faith. It has to be done because the faiths are being defamed in some way. In fact, that will simply backfire against those faiths. And this has to be said very clearly, because freedom of expression is both an absolute freedom, and yet it requires complete consciousness and control by those who use it, so that they know that they are not to use their freedom of expression in order to provoke hatred or war or loathing against any particular group of any sort. That's a public responsibility in the use of freedom of expression. But you don't help, we don't help, none of us help ourselves if we try to limit the freedom of expression when it is deeply and offendingly misused. And I think we saw a very interesting example of this the other day when this minor pastor in Florida, a man of no consequence, probably even to his wife, said, you know, that he was going to burn the Koran. And there were two approaches. One was that he must be stopped. He must be denied. There must be laws to prevent this. But actually, the other possibility was what happened. What happened was that everybody talked about it. And the more freedom of expression was used, the more it was talked about around the world, the more he appeared to be a fool. And the more he was isolated inside the United States. And by actually talking it through, horrible and uncomfortable though it was, a great victory was won for Islam in the United States, in my opinion. And at the heart of it all, the great poet Rumi said, human beings are discourse. We are discourse. And it's through the full use of that talking, hurtful and uncomfortable though it often is, that we find our way to truth within our religions and within our lives. And as I said earlier, it is, after all, Islam that has Aristotle and the rational core, and therefore is the best placed in many ways of the three to understand the full importance of freedom of expression. The third point I want to make is this, that it's often thought that the struggle or the division going on is between the state versus religion, or secularism versus religion, or the absence of religious rules versus morality. But I think that this is, in a way, a simplification of the choices that we really have. The great elements, you could call them the great divisions, but I think the great elements are ethics, morality, and spiritualism. And the danger is, and political leaders, religious leaders, university leaders often become very confused about this, and they mix the three together and call it all morality, and talk about moral imperatives and so on. And they end up interpreting sacred laws through morality. And so I went through the topics that have been discussed over the last few days, and I thought adultery, and there was a proper discussion about how technology has changed the nature of adultery through pornography, and you heard a great deal about that. But what's interesting is there is absolutely no sign that tough rules about public morality in any of the areas of the three Abrahamic religions has led to any less use of pornography. Quite the opposite. It seems often that where there are tough rules, there's more use of pornography, or at least as much. And I'm not taking a laissez-faire approach on pornography. I'm just pointing out how it actually seems to work. Or there was the session on the Islamic theories of the economy. And of course, the Islamic theories of economy, like the pre-capitalist theories of economy and Christianity, particularly regarding debt, are wonderful theories. And what's interesting about them is they're extremely modern and postmodern. It's cases of where you have to go backwards in order to go forwards. They're very relevant today. People need to know that Islam has these theories, and I think this is a great task for Islamic thinkers to put forward to the non-Islamic world how interesting the Islamic theories of economics are. Of course, it would be nice if there were an Islamic nation state that actually applied them, or for that matter, a Christian nation state, or any nation state that applied them. But in spite of the fact that nobody's applying these ideas, they are useful, they're dynamic theories, and they're very relevant to the future. Or there was the theory on honoring thy parents, the session on honoring thy parents. Obviously, an essential religious rule, an essential rule of any sort. Providing, of course, that we're able to separate out the not too unfrequent tyranny of parents in earlier times over their children. In other words, respect for parents is not to be an excuse for tyranny of elders over the young. But in all three of the Abrahamic religions, there is this idea of honoring thy parents. And it is all about context, it's about belonging, it's about love. And I think one of the most interesting things in Canada is that perhaps the most interesting example in this country of a live community that talks endlessly and rightfully about honoring their parents are the First Nations and the Aboriginals as a whole, because it is completely an elder-based civilization. Of course, it can go wrong, and there are many cases of it going wrong, but the idea of respect for the elders is central to Aboriginals. And what's interesting about it is, and I think it's something which is very clear among Aboriginals in Canada, is respect for elders is tied to respect for place and for community, and therefore it's tied to the environment, which you've heard a great deal about. And what's fascinating about this is that the original Canadian conversation, for hundreds of years, for at least 250 years, the original Canadian conversation was a conversation between the people who were here, the First Nations, and the people who came here, the immigrants, whoever they were. And it was that conversation which shaped this country at its best, not something that was brought from England or France. That's the essential conversation. And I think that we need to get back to that conversation between the First Nations, the Aboriginals, and the immigrants, new citizens. And I think that Islam, with its theme of respect for elders, could play a very interesting and important role in that in Canada. And finally, on that theme, this is linked to the idea that we're all from the same parents, a very clear Islamic idea. And Dr. Matson talked about circles of community, an Islamic idea, but an Aboriginal idea. The whole idea, a non-linear approach to civilization, that we live in circles, and you bring more people into the circles, and the citizen joins the circle, and the circle becomes larger and more complicated, with many circles inside it. All of that is something which we need to be thinking about. But these are ethical ideas, ideas of spiritual imagination. My general point is really this, and I'll give you an example of the general point. Materialism is a terrible problem. You've been talking about this, a terrible problem of our time. It's certainly a moral problem, but the solution is ethical and spiritual. The 6 aims of Islamic sacred law are dynamic. Their relationship to the 10 Commandments, I think, reinforces and clarifies the ideas in the 10 Commandments. So think of this, all of the 6 and the 10, think of them in ethical terms, which is to say, think of them in terms of mercy, of empathy, of inclusion, of consideration, of anti-racism, of economic justice, of egalitarianism, of responsibility to place, environmentalism, and of fair treatment of the other. Imagining the other, that's what that all can be summed up as in philosophical terms. Imagining the other, the person we don't know, the person we might like to love, but we don't know them, so we can only love them in a very abstract and distant way. But imagining the other produces respect for the other. And this, in turn, leads to attitudes that have an effect on morality. Those who act in an ethical manner towards the other are much more likely to act with morality in mind. But, on the other hand, those who lead with morality may just as easily serve justice or evil. The public moralizer may often be an ethical monster. We saw this in the West with Victorian Christian morality. We went through 150 years of Victorian ethical morality, where they claimed a moral leadership while there was an ethical bankruptcy. It's ethics which is existential and rational, and spiritualism, which has enormous force behind it, which creates the energy in society which makes it more likely that there will be morality. And spiritualism, what's interesting about spiritualism when it's put beside ethics is spiritualism is the transcendental version of ethics. They are the same thing in 2 different forms, one solid and the other in the spirit. And together they are, if you like, the unbeatable force. They can produce ethical action, and in turn, that will encourage a degree of moral purpose. So we were asked, coming here as speakers, how can the 6 universal aims of Islamic law give purpose to our lives in relationship to the 10 Commandments? And the answer to me is relatively simple in the world of philosophy, applied philosophy, which is not simple at all. Otherwise, we'd be much better at what we're doing than we are. But yet the answer is extremely simple. If you lead with ethics and with spiritualism, the rest will follow. Thank you very much.